Our next speaker has contributed to IPAN previously, and we're extremely fortunate to have Dr. Al Palazzo with us again this afternoon. Al is adjunct professor have these on, at University of New South Wales, Canberra. Formerly, he was Director of War Studies in the Australian Army Research Centre, a part of the Australian Army headquarters. He's written articles on alternative defence for Australia, including on armed neutrality and one on planning not to lose, which sounds like a good idea. His next book is on climate change and its implications for national security. And so we're extremely pleased that you could join us this afternoon, Al, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue.
Phil does it for you.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Phil. Well, let's go to the first one. So this will be the theme of my talk, is that if you're going to form a defense force, you sort of should know what you're forming it against. So next slide, please. And at the moment, the Australian, these are the sort of the two big threats out there that are talked about. One, of course, is China, and the other is climate change. Next. So I say both threats are real because, not that China is planning to invade Australia, but through their actions, which is growing assertiveness, the challenging to the existing world order, and its role as an emerging global power, there's a perception that China is doing things that will upset the American, well, the word you've used here is hegemony. And in doing so, would also affect Australia's perspective or its place in the world. And so we're not talking about attack on Australia, we're talking about Australia's interests and its perception of its interests and the place Australia sees itself in the US global order. Of course, there's also climate change as a threat, and this in the defense community gets much less talk. Back when I was still with defense 18 months ago, when Peter Dutton was minister, not only could you not say the words climate change, you couldn't even think them. Somehow he would know. But yes, climate change, yes, welcome to the Anthropocene, when humanity is now driving the climate. It's going to result in the destabilization of the natural world, which will have flow-on effects for humanity, the provision of essential resources. And when I say essential, I mean water and food, and could destabilize societies, which will then result in war between societies, and also might push people into mass migration. So when Syria had its civil war and millions of people left, that could happen again, but on a much grander scale. And when I also say that these destabilizing societies will lead to wars, either within or between societies, I don't mean the optional wars of choice that we've experienced so often in the past. These are going to be real nasty wars of existence, wars where there's a winner and a clear loser, and the loser's probably dead and the winner continues on. So really nasty conflicts. But these are what I see as the threats. And how does the government see these threats, and where do they set the priorities? Well, for the Australian government, it's clearly most significant threat is China. And the Australian Defence Force is being built around the idea of war with China. And that is what it's expecting, and that's why it's also leading to greater involvement with the United States military as an offset to a Chinese war. But I would argue for the Australian people, not the government, but the Australian people, most of us, or the majority of us, would consider climate change as the major threat to this country. Even the government doesn't expect China to invade Australia. It's just our interests. Whereas, of course, depending on your community that you live in now, many parts of Australia are already being ravaged by climate change problems. And of course, climate change is the only one that actually threatens extinction. China may upset the apple cart and force the United States to withdraw from the Western Pacific, and there'll be a reorganization of world power, and US hegemony might not be as absolute as it once was, but none of that is going to result in extinction, whereas climate change might. So, I've been puzzling out, why does the government have such a position? And I think there's a few reasons here. And, one is that I have a sense that when it comes to defense issues, security issues, our politicians are inherently just lazy. Since 1901, the policy has been, we'll look to a great power to provide for security, and it's worked reasonably well, with a few complications here and there, but that's been the game. And so we've been able to offset a lot of our security responsibilities to first Britain and now the United States. And so our political leaders have never really had to think hard about security. Most of the thinking is done in America, and we just sort of fall in underneath it. And so it's really easy for our political masters to get away with that. That's absence of hard thinking, really robust thinking. But there are also other reasons. Of course, if the government was to prioritize climate change as the threat, it would go against what the United States is saying. The United States is clearly articulating China as the threat. And so Australia now agrees. And, it doesn't really consider or approach climate change from the perspective of it being a threat to Australia's existence or way of life. And, like most countries, the political leadership is not really doing a hell of a lot to prevent climate change and to reduce to zero the greenhouse gas emissions. It's all just continuing, and we just finished another gab fest in Cairo with COP27 coming to an end without nothing really being accomplished. But I thought also another reason why China continues to be the #1 threat, and that has to do with my community, a member of the national security thinker community. Most of my colleagues, their worldview is based upon state versus state. They study this at university growing up. They did their PhDs on some kind of security threat relationship where the adversaries were both states. They've created a worldview that looks at threats through the viewpoint of a state. And so to now suddenly articulate climate change, they would have to overturn their own worldview that they've written books about, in which they've put so much effort and built their careers around, into something like that, into switching now to a different understanding of what security actually means, and that security from nature should actually be a higher priority than security from another state. And so what they write, and we've discussed about ASPI and other think tanks, and what they write tends to reinforce this state perspective because they don't know any other way of doing it, and they're just unable to change. And see, I'm a military historian. I'm not an international relations person. Historians can do these things and take these different viewpoints, but IR people can't. So what's the consequences of pursuing the wrong priority? Defining your defense force around the wrong threat, or at least not the major threat, the really big threat. Well, we're optimizing the Australian Defence Force for a second-tier priority, for a threat that's much less dangerous than one that poses extinction. And because of that, that's why we're getting things, or we're talking about getting things like nuclear-powered submarines, which, if you saw my piece in the Saturday paper, is just a dumb idea. or the Hunter frigates. It's going to be a colossal screw up. And now we're even talking about getting B-21 bombers, whose only utility is to attack China or go to war with China with the United States. They're all useless in a climate crisis. They have no apparent utility at all, but still we're going to spend upwards of $200 to $300 billion on getting things that do nothing to protect us or secure us from the major threat. So what should we do? What is needed? Because I think it is possible to optimize the ADF for climate change. It's just a different ADF. Although I would guess, hazard a guess, like 80% of the defense force will remain the same. But that 20% that you change is going to be quite significant. And so I think the main task of the future ADF is to help maintain the social contract of not only Australia, but more particularly the countries in the region, our neighbors. And when I say maintain the social contract, I mean, countries are held together by certain beliefs and practices, laws, and when climate change starts to really bite, okay, these countries are going to come under stress. They're going to start to fracture, right? Divisions will appear, and different loyalties will form, and these states may fall apart. And you remember that there's in the Horn of Africa, the country of Somalia, which still is largely what in the business we call an ungoverned space. There's nobody there who's really in charge of the country of Somalia. There's a bunch of warlords, each one fighting for the resources of the country. And that is what will probably happen in our region. Is that under climate change stress, there's the potential for ungoverned spaces to appear to our north, which will be catastrophic. It's really bad outcome for Australia to have that kind of disruption in the neighborhood. And so I would see the ADF going into these areas and trying to help hold these countries together, to reset them onto a new organization or reinforce the existing organization so that their social contracts continue, that they maintain those social contracts so that those states or these countries or peoples continue to function with governments that can at least meet their minimal needs. And that will require a lot of transport. So instead of B-21 bombers, I would be buying a lot more C-17s and C-130 transport aircraft, a lot more maritime shipping. So, the things like that we could use for disaster relief. We're always sending the Truls out, or the Adelaide or the Canberra. We need more things like that, not submarines. But frankly, we also need a larger army, and an army that is robust. So the other day there's an article in the Australian where people, proclaiming the end of the tank and the infantry fighting vehicle. Well, those are big armored vehicles. Well, I think that's the opposite of what we need. And I'm happy to hear people disagree with me. But these are going to be nasty wars in our neighborhood. And to do that, you're going to put soldiers in the field, and they're going to need really robust pieces of equipment to be able to contend with that environment and restabilize those regions. So this needs a larger army that is robustly equipped. But unfortunately, the way this works out in defense and the way the force structure review is leaning, the Army is going to be the afterthought, and Navy is going to get the largest sum. All right, next, please. But also say this is what is also needed, and this is at the federal level, which is a disaster response force that complements the state-based agencies, the emergency services. And it's not to replace them, but I would say we need these to be like a paramilitary force where they're uniformed, subject to military discipline, probably mainly reservists who would then be summoned to duty in the case of a crisis, and thereby being sent to reinforce the state-based agencies where something particularly nasty has happened. And being federally, they would also have the really expensive high-end equipment that you need, like water bombers or riverine craft that you can go upriver in a flood to rescue people, and specialized vehicles that can go through swamps to deliver feed to cut off livestock. And then when they've worked at one area, they go back to their normal jobs. And then if another disaster occurs, they'd be called out for that too. And this equipment would be standing around waiting for them. So fully equipped with specialized equipment. And also, most importantly, you would need a full-time planning staff. And this is perhaps the most important thing, because we don't really have somebody who does, we have coordination. We don't have planning that we can anticipate what is needed in this community when this crisis occurs. So we can stockpile those resources for a domestic response and perhaps also for an international response. So this is what I'm advocating here is, almost another uniform service, and maybe part of the Defense Force, maybe as part of a different agency, but something that we've never had, before, which will be another impost upon our taxes. But I think with climate change coming, it's the kind of thing that we need in order to prepare for a crisis response in Australia. So that's what I've been looking at, and I think that's the last slide. Yes. And I don't know how we're going to do this or how it gets done. But to me, climate change is the important threat, the one that we should be organizing ourselves to prepare for, and for the disasters and wars that it will bring. Whereas China is a problem that is of much lower magnitude. And I can tell you that's a minority view in my community. And one last slide. And Sue, there should be one last slide. Sue mentioned that, my book is actually out. It arrived a little while ago, and it's free. And it's published by the U.S. Army because, we couldn't get it published. I couldn't get it published here. And you just search my name with climate change, national security, if you're interested in reading about a military interpretation of what climate change means, which is very different from what most people think about. But yeah, feel free to download it, from the U.S. government, and it's freely, widely available. And thank you for your time.